An anonymous soldier, not a professor, not an archaeologist, not a sinologist, sitting in a museum in Houston, Texas, looks at a fragment of bronze dug out of the ground in Western China and says, I know what this is. I know what it says. And what it says proves that one of the most powerful governments on Earth has been lying to its own people for over a century. Today, we are pulling apart a body of research that touches iconographic writing, the buried history of ancient China, and the Chinese Communist Party's decades-long assault on its own civilizational record. By the end of this episode, you will understand what iconographic writing actually is, why the CCP's official account of Chinese history is, according to the research, not just wrong, but catastrophically and deliberately wrong, and what a cache of Bronze Age artifacts buried in the Sichuan Basin has to do with all of it. I have with me someone who has spent considerable time with this material, and I want to start with the most basic question possible. Who is the author, and why should we take any of this seriously?
Well, that is precisely the right place to begin, because the author is at pains to address that question directly. The research is published under the name An Unknown Soldier, and the author explains that choice quite deliberately, crediting the United States Armed Forces with the training that made the discovery possible. The author states, and I am quoting from the research here, that the discovery was made in 2011 when a writing system in widespread use throughout the archaic world was deciphered. The author calls it iconographic writing, because it modulates visual information rather than verbal information. And the first thing to understand is that this is not a fringe claim about alien civilizations or lost continents. The research is grounded in cartography, in the geometry of solar observation, and in a compositional logic the author traces from the British Isles to dynastic Egypt to Bronze Age China.
Right, and the discovery itself began in Wales, didn't it? Not in China at all.
It did. The research describes the author accidentally deciphering what is called the Bryncelli pattern stone in the National Museum of Wales in Cardiff in 2011, a megalith found buried beneath a mound on the Isle of Anglesey, radiocarbon dated to around 3,500 BC. From there, the research extended to Iberian iconography, specifically the Dama de Elche, a carving from around 400 BC, which the author demonstrates is not decorative art at all, but a cartographic composition, its profile matching the geology of Spain and Portugal with what the research describes as near irrefutable precision. And from Iberia, the author moved to dynastic Egypt, where the argument is made that Egyptian hieroglyphics did not emerge from nowhere, but represent an innovation on a much older, globally distributed iconographic writing system.
So the claim is that there was a single writing system used across the ancient world based on cartography, on the shapes of actual landscapes, and that Egypt simply upgraded it into hieroglyphics while everyone else kept using the older form.
That is the author's argument, yes. The research puts it rather memorably. Egypt upgraded to Twitter while her neighbors remained with conventional mail. And the compositional rules the author identifies are remarkably consistent. Rule 1, the constitution of a realm had to look like the realm it documented, based on cartography. Rule 2, the king had to look like the kingdom, which the author argues explains all the elaborate headdresses of archaic rulers. Rule 3, every station of the nobility had to be represented by icons within the boundary of the realm, almost always in geophysical relationship to each other. These are not aesthetic choices. According to the research, they are syntactical rules of a writing system.
And the technique used to produce these cartographic compositions, the author calls it soloromancy.
Yes, and this is one of the more elegant passages in the research. Soloromancy is described as an archaic priestly rite of divination, but the underlying technique is disarmingly simple. You plant a staff upright in the ground, mark the tip of its shadow, wait for the shadow to move, mark the new position, and draw a line between the two marks. That line is a perfect east-to-west orientation every time. The author notes it remains more accurate than modern GPS satellites. From that baseline, you measure azimuths to distant landmarks, trace those lines onto a cloth, and over years of repeated observation, you build an increasingly precise cartographic record of your region. The author illustrates this with Moses on Mount Sinai, arguing that the burning bush of Exodus is a phonetic description of an iconographic map of the kingdom of Midian produced through exactly this process.
Which is a remarkable claim in its own right, but let us bring this to China, because that is where the research becomes genuinely incendiary. The CCP's official history of China, where does it begin, and why does the author regard that as a problem?
The research is very precise on this. Until recently, academic consensus placed the beginning of Chinese history at the inception of the Qin dynasty, around 221 BC. And the operative phrase there, as the author notes, is until recently. The Chinese Communist Party, following the lead of what the research calls the skeptical school of Chinese history, a movement founded by socialist scholars at Beijing University in 1910, declared everything prior to 221 BC to be, and I am quoting directly, imperialist propaganda, criminalized. The Xia, Shang, and Zhou dynasties, the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors of the Confucian classics, all of it was officially declared fiction. Royal propaganda invented by Confucian monks to keep the proletariat in subjugation.
And Mao Zedong adopted this wholesale.
He did, and the consequences were catastrophic. The research states that upwards of 50 million Chinese intellectuals, politicians, administrators, and civil servants were slaughtered during Mao's revolution, in part to suppress China's true history and culture. The author does not use that figure lightly. The research frames this as one of the great crimes of the 20th century, a deliberate, state-sanctioned erasure of thousands of years of documented civilization, enforced through mass murder. And the author makes a point that is almost darkly comic in its logic. The skeptical school insisted that everything before the Qin dynasty was fiction, but the Qin dynasty itself arose out of the Warring States period, a period defined by 7 warring states. If Qin rose from what preceded Qin could not have been a fiction. The contradiction was glaring from the very beginning.
That is a rather devastating internal contradiction, isn't it? You cannot simultaneously claim that 7 states were at war and that 6 of them did not exist.
Precisely. And the research draws a vivid parallel between Qin Shi Huang, China's first self-proclaimed emperor, who ruled for 14 years before dying in a vain attempt to achieve physical immortality, and the CCP's own leadership. Qin Shi Huang built a terracotta army to accompany him into the afterlife. The research notes, with considerable acidity, that disbelief in the afterlife appears to offer no immunity from building terracotta armies. Xi Jinping, the author suggests, is repeating the same pattern, a leader obsessed with legacy, suppressing history, and branding all opposition as barbarians.
And the term Han Chinese, the research has something quite specific to say about that, doesn't it?
This is one of the most striking arguments in the entire body of research. The author contends that Han was never an ethnic designation. At inception, Han was derived from the term huaxia, which translates literally as beautiful grandeur. Conceptually, the word Han equated to the word civilized. After Qin Shi Huang's death, the coalition that overthrew him claimed the title civilized for themselves. Han was an adjective, a qualitative term, not a proper noun describing an ethnic group. And the author draws an explicit and deliberately unsettling parallel. Both the Chinese word Han and the Sanskrit word Aryan are qualitative adjectives that were subsequently misappropriated as ethnic identifiers. The research states plainly that nobody in the ancient world thought of the Han or the Aryans as ethnic groups.
That parallel to Aryan is not a subtle one. The author is making a very direct comparison to what happened in early 20th century Europe.
The author makes it explicitly, and the research extends the parallel further. Just as Adolf Hitler attempted to establish a Reich to last 1,000 years, Qin Shi Huang attempted to attain literal immortality. Both failed. The research suggests Xi Jinping is heading in the same direction, and the author addresses him directly at several points, which is one of the more unusual features of this body of work. It is simultaneously a work of historical and linguistic scholarship and a direct political provocation.
Let us talk about the archaeology, because this is where the research moves from argument to evidence. The Sanxingdui site, what is it, and why does the author regard it as so significant?
Sanxingdui is an archaeological site along an obscure river in the Sichuan Basin in western China. In 1986, a buried cache of Bronze Age artifacts was discovered there. Radiocarbon dates place the burial of that cache at around 1200 BC. Then in 2021, additional caches of similarly discarded artifacts were found nearby, ascribed to the same period and culture. The research notes that the author conducted analysis on these artifacts as early as 2013, and that subsequent to that work, accredited academia formally acknowledged the Sanxingdui culture of early Bronze Age China. Crucially, Sanxingdui falls squarely within the Shang dynasty, one of the 3 dynasties the skeptical school of Chinese history had declared to be fiction.
So the archaeology itself has already begun to vindicate the Confucian historical record that Mao dismissed.
Exactly, and the research is emphatic on this point. The author states that accredited academia has proven that the Shang and Zhou dynasties both did in fact exist, and then instructs the reader to read that sentence again, because the implications are enormous. Since the skeptical school provided what the research calls the moral vacuum filled by Mao's bloody rampage across Asia, and since that school's central claims have now been disproven by archaeology, the entire ideological foundation for the Cultural Revolution's assault on Chinese history has collapsed.
What did the author actually find at Sanxingdui? What are these artifacts?
The collection is extraordinary. The research describes bronze cast masks of enormous scale, the largest, from forehead to chin, nearly 4 feet tall. The author notes that at that scale, the word mask is almost absurd. These were larger-than-life sculptures, likely installed on scaffolds and dressed in textiles with only their polished bronze faces visible. There are 3 of these very large masks, and the author interprets them as the 3 sovereigns referenced in the Confucian classics, the ruling triad at the apex of an archaic realm. Then, there are 6 smaller bronze heads, about 2 feet tall, which the author associates with the 5 emperors of the Confucian record. Noting that the 6th figure introduces an interpretive puzzle the research does not claim to resolve definitively.
And there is a standing figure as well, a very large one.
Yes, and this is perhaps the most dramatic artifact in the collection. The research describes a bronze figure standing nearly 20 feet tall, including its base, the only complete, larger-than-life figure found at Sanxingdui. Every square inch of this figure, front, back, and both sides, is covered in what the author calls an iconographic markup language which has yet to be fully deciphered. The base is formed with 4 legs, not 3, and the research explains that this is iconographically significant. A 3-legged base identifies a realm governed by ruling triads, while a 4-legged base suggests an extension of the nobility, a government enlarged to serve more efficiently. The author interprets this figure as a royal herald, and notes that the hands appear to have been holding something, a banner perhaps.
And then there is the Garuda figurehead. That is where the research makes its most provocative claim about the origins of Chinese civilization.
This is where the research becomes genuinely explosive in its implications. A complete figure of Garuda, the great avian deity of Hindu and Buddhist tradition, was found on a regalia stave at Sanxingdui, and the author argues that this single artifact establishes who watched over the realm where this collection was originally installed. Garuda is not a Chinese figure. Garuda is found throughout India, Southeast Asia, at Angkor Wat in Cambodia. The research compares the crown of the Sanxingdui Garuda with a carving at Angkor Wat attributed to the 5th or 6th century AD, 1,300 miles away and over 1,000 years later, and finds the crowns remarkably similar. The author's conclusion is that the constitutional and iconographic traditions of what we call China were not indigenous to China at all.
So the research is arguing that Chinese civilization, at its roots, is Indonesian and Austronesian in origin.
That is precisely the argument. The author states it directly: ancient Chinese secrets are not Chinese at all, but Indonesian. And this is framed as a direct refutation of what the research calls Sinocentric chauvinism, the CCP's recently adopted position that all Asian countries, including Korea, Japan, and the kingdoms along the Mekong, are derived from an earlier civilization in China. The research calls this a breathtaking reversal from the CCP's earlier position and describes it as catastrophically wrong. The evidence the author marshals includes the figure of Kuan Yin, described in the research not as a goddess, as Western scholars have labeled her, but as a saint, a royal of archaic Indonesia credited with mothering the founding kindreds of archaic China.
And there is also the Kinara, the chimeric figure found in the Sanxingdui pits.
Yes. The research describes fragments of a kinara, a chimeric creature with a human head and torso and the wings and lower body of a bird, recovered from Pit 2 at Sanxingdui. Kinara are regarded throughout India, the Himalayas, the Tibetan Plateau, and all along the Mekong as pre-Vedic figures. Finding one in the Sichuan Basin, in a context dated to 1500 BC, is significant precisely because it places Southeast Asian iconographic traditions at the heart of what the CCP insists is an exclusively Chinese cultural origin. The author also notes that the thigh of the Kinara is engraved with glyphs typical of Shang dynasty artifacts, a script no one has yet deciphered, and anticipates this will prove to be an iconographic markup language serving as a bridge toward formal pictographic writing.
Now, I want to raise the counter-argument here because it is a fair one. The CCP has, in recent years, acknowledged the Shang and Zhou dynasties. Hasn't the situation improved? Isn't the party correcting course?
The research addresses this directly, and the author's view is that the CCP's acknowledgement is not a correction but a co-option. The party has decided, in the author's words, to head the revolt off at the pass by openly embracing Confucianism as the CCP's official philosopher. But the research argues this is a neutered Confucianism, a Confucius stripped of Tian, the creator god whom Confucius explicitly credits with giving him life, watching over him, and judging his actions. In the Analects, Confucius writes extensively on Tian as an eternal, loving intellect. The author argues that no scholar and no CCP functionary can erase the fact that Confucius credits Tian for giving him life. Abstract concepts of supernatural forces, the research notes, cannot impart life, perceive, or judge.
So Xi Jinping is essentially doing what Mao did, taking the parts of Chinese tradition that are useful and discarding the parts that are inconvenient.
The research puts it more sharply than that. In Confucius's thought, the family was the essential structural element of society and the agency through which Tian worked in history. In Xi Jinping thought, the research argues, the family Xi instructs his followers to devote themselves to are agents of the CCP. The Han Chinese become the family, and the CCP becomes Tian. The author calls this a dangerous revisionist lie, and the research draws the linguistic parallel again. In evoking Han Chinese as a pseudo-ethnicity, Xi is establishing an ideological boundary between acceptable and unacceptable Chinese citizens, in precisely the manner that the misappropriation of Aryan established a boundary in early 20th century Europe.
The Miao people come into the research at this point as well, and I find this one of the more quietly devastating details in the entire body of work.
It is a remarkable passage. The Miao are an ethnic group living today in Hunan, which the research pointedly notes is the region Mao Zedong claimed as his cultural cradle. The author examines the traditional headdresses of the Miao and finds that their geometry cannot be distinguished from the regalia crown of the Garuda figurehead at Sanxingdui. More than that, the research notes that Miao oral tradition, as maintained by the Miao themselves, not by CCP histories, recalls that the Miao were driven by conflict to move to Hunan. And in every traditional Miao headdress, a butterfly is discreetly sewn into the fabric in superposition above all else. The author interprets this butterfly as the iconographic angel of the founders of China, the same butterfly associated with Kuan Yin's clergy, who shepherded the founding kindreds from Indonesia along the coast to the Pearl, Yangtze, and Yellow rivers.
So the Miao are carrying, in their textiles, a living memory of a history the CCP declared did not exist.
That is the author's argument, and it is a powerful one. The research also notes that the royal herald at Sanxingdui was not carrying a Chinese dragon aloft in procession, as Sinocentric interpretations would have it, but a naga, the serpentine figure of Southeast Asian tradition. The author states that this fact alone, once the full iconographic case is made, will end what the research calls Sinocentric chauvinism. The CCP's assertion that all Asian civilizations derive from an earlier Chinese civilization is, in the author's view, not just historically wrong, but precisely inverted.
And the Chinese zodiac, the research has something to say about that as well.
Yes, and this is one of the more unexpected arguments. The author contends that the 12 creatures of the Chinese zodiac were not originally astronomical symbols, but were each derived from the earliest kingdoms of what came to be known as China: the rat, fox, tiger, rabbit, dragon, snake, horse, goat, monkey, rooster, dog, and pig kingdoms each distinguished themselves in the Archaic period, and on the passing of their exemplary leaders, those leaders were believed to have transcended this life and taken their place among the stars. The zodiac, in this reading, is not a calendar of superstition, but a star chart directly reflecting the political history of the realm. The author notes having identified the principal nobility associated with 11 of the 12 zodiac creatures, all except the rat.
Which is a rather extraordinary claim, that the Chinese zodiac is essentially a constitutional record of archaic kingdoms encoded in astronomical iconography.
And it connects to the broader argument about what the research calls the Vedic threshold, a period around 1500 BC when, the author argues, civilizations across the world simultaneously innovated on iconographic writing and began developing more elaborate forms, leading directly to cuneiform, pictographic, and phonetic writing systems. The research suggests the conflict that resulted in the Sanxingdui cache being hurriedly buried may be connected to this threshold, and raises the prospect, carefully, that the war responsible for this destruction may be the Mahabharata. The author does not claim to resolve that question, but insists the artifacts and the specific damage they received demand scholarly inquiry.
Let us talk about the tone of the research for a moment, because it is unusual. This is not a dry academic paper. The author addresses Xi Jinping directly, compares the CCP to the Nazi Party, and at one point dedicates the entire body of research to the victims of Mao's Cultural Revolution. How do you read that?
I think the author is making a deliberate choice. The research acknowledges that many are better suited to this task, those are the author's own words, but argues that the stakes are too high for academic caution. The research states that over 100 million lives were extinguished in China over the last century because a clique of college professors in 1910 lost faith in Confucian theology and declared thousands of years of history to be fiction. The author is not writing for a journal. The author is writing for the Chinese people, for the diaspora, for the students who raised their voices in Tiananmen Square, described in the research as the children of those Mao murdered, and for what the author calls the righteous of the world. The political urgency is inseparable from the scholarly argument.
And the research is quite specific about what it intends to prove, not just the Shang and Zhou dynasties, which archaeology has already vindicated, but the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, which the CCP still regards as mythological.
Yes. The author states the intention to document, to the satisfaction of every university in existence, that the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, scorned as lies by Mao, were factual principles of the nobility in the Archaic period, and the iconographic evidence from Sanxingdui is the foundation of that argument. The 3 large bronze masks interpreted as the 3 sovereigns, the 6 smaller heads associated with the 5 emperors, the Garuda figurehead establishing the Southeast Asian constitutional tradition at the heart of the realm, all of this is presented as a coherent, decipherable record. Not mythology.
There is also the question of Confucius himself and the religious reforms of the 6th and 5th centuries BC. The research places Confucianism in a much wider context than we usually encounter.
This is one of the more intellectually ambitious passages in the research. The author argues that the religious reforms of the period between 600 and 500 BC, which produced Buddhism, Confucianism, and parallel reforms in India and Arabia, were all responses to the same underlying crisis. The kindred in common could not reconcile the various names for the creator across different regional traditions, and reform-minded leaders chose to forsake the use of proper nouns for the creator. This is why both Buddhism and Confucianism appear to depersonalize the creator. But the author insists this depersonalization was a rhetorical strategy, not a theological position. Confucius credits Tian with giving him life. Buddhists refer to the immortal truth in their worship. The research argues that 20th century academia, reading these texts as rhetoric rather than testimonial, made the same error as Mao's skeptical school.
And the CCP's co-option of Confucianism strips out precisely that theological dimension.
Exactly. The research describes the CCP's Confucius as a neutered figurehead, a family-loving philosopher who did not worship a god. The author calls this a sleight of mind that must be opposed, and notes that no comprehensive rebuttal has yet been advanced by accredited academia to counter what the research calls President Xi's plagiarism of Confucian thought. The author then offers what is described as an amateur's roundhouse, a direct reading of the Analects, demonstrating that Confucius's references to Tian as an eternal, loving intellect who watches over and judges believers cannot be abstracted away without doing violence to the text.
I want to step back for a moment and consider the scope of what is being claimed here. The research is not just arguing about Chinese history, it is arguing about the origins of writing itself, about the global distribution of a single iconographic system, about the deep roots of civilization in Indonesia and Austronesia. How does the author account for the fact that this has not been recognized before?
The author acknowledges that the scope of the discovery is so massive that it requires the dedicated efforts of a generation to complete. In the British Isles alone, the research notes, there are over 3 million artifacts in the national collections of England, Wales, Ireland, Scotland, and the Isle of Man. If 5 minutes were devoted to each, it would take 150 years just to complete a first pass. The author is not claiming to have finished the work. The research is explicitly described as a first interpretation. And the author raises a genuinely unsettling question. If this writing system was in use throughout the world for millennia, how did it fade from memory? The research does not claim to answer that. It simply notes that the thought is ominous.
There is also the question of what the research calls narrative compression, the tendency of ancient scribes to compress vast chronological depths into more recent timeframes because the true antiquity of the record was simply too difficult to accept.
Yes, and the author draws a direct parallel between ancient scribes at the Vedic threshold struggling to accept that civilization could be as old as the religious canon suggested, and Mao Zedong's skeptical school struggling to accept that Chinese history could predate the Qin dynasty. The cognitive dissonance is the same. The research argues that archaic narratives filled with iconographic creatures performing what appeared to be superhuman feats were not mythology but constitutional documents, and that the failure to read them as such, whether in the 5th century BC or the 20th century AD, has had catastrophic consequences.
So when you step back from all of this, the iconographic writing system, the Sanxingdui artifacts, the CCP's assault on Chinese history, the figure of Kuan Yin as a saint rather than a goddess, the meow butterfly sewn into headdresses in Hunan. What does the research ultimately ask us to understand?
I think the research asks us to understand several things simultaneously. First, that the CCP's official history of China is not merely incomplete, but was constructed through the deliberate destruction of evidence and the murder of those who preserved it. Second, that archaeology has already begun to vindicate the Confucian historical record that Mao declared fiction, and that the author's iconographic research, if authenticated, would extend that vindication far deeper into the archaic than even the most generous current academic consensus allows. Third, that the traditions the CCP is now attempting to co-opt, Confucianism, Han identity, the memory of the 3 sovereigns and 5 emperors, are not the CCP's to claim, because they belong to a civilizational inheritance that predates the Qin dynasty by thousands of years and originates not in China, but in Indonesia and Australasia.
And the research dedicates all of this to the victims of Mao's Cultural Revolution.
It does. The author states the intention to read the epithet of the skeptical school of Chinese history and to dedicate the research on China's iconographic record to the memory of their millions of innocent victims. That is not a rhetorical flourish. The research is explicit that the students who raised their voices in Tiananmen Square were the children of those Mao murdered, and that the students who today mock Xi Jinping in Winnie the Pooh memes are the children of Tiananmen. The chain of consequence runs directly from the professors of 1910 to the present day.
Here is what this really comes down to, I think. An anonymous soldier, someone who credits not a university but the United States Armed Forces with the training that made this discovery possible, has used a technique taught in basic training, a staff and a shadow and a line drawn east to west, to read documents that have been sitting in plain sight for thousands of years. And what those documents say is that the walls the CCP built around Chinese history are not just politically motivated, they are archaeologically, iconographically, and constitutionally indefensible.
And the research makes clear that the CCP knows this. The author notes that China's academic community has already relegated Mao to what is described as terracotta status. They know the game is up, and the rehabilitation of Confucius is the CCP's attempt to stake out moral high ground before the full reckoning arrives. But a Confucius stripped of Tian, the author argues, is not Confucius at all. It is a costume. And the iconographic record at Sanxingdui, the butterfly in the meow headdress, the naga in the herald's hands, these are not costumes. They are constitutions. They are the actual record of who the Chinese people are and where they came from.
The research ends with a direct address to President Xi, think, Xi, and a promise that Taiwan does not belong to China, but that China belongs to Taiwan. That is a provocation of a very particular kind.
It is, and it connects to the iconographic argument. The author claims to have identified Taiwan as what the research calls the living heart of Sufanahong, the phoenix of Asia, an archaic realm the author traces to around 79,000 BC following the Toba eruption in Indonesia. Whether one accepts that chronological depth or not, the political point is clear. The author is arguing that the democratic government of Taiwan is not a rogue province of the People's Republic, but the legitimate heir to a civilizational tradition the CCP has spent a century trying to destroy.
Which brings us, rather neatly, back to where we began. A supply clerk in the United States Army sitting in a museum in Houston, looking at a fragment of bronze pulled from the ground in Western China and saying, "I know what this is." The research calls it a first interpretation. It is, by any measure, an extraordinary one.
The author invites peer review, invites criticism, and invites the CCP to answer for its crimes before posterity does it for them.
And if the author is wrong?
The research addresses that too, with a certain dry wit. The author notes that if the analysis is failing academically, the failure will be limited to an online video, whereas Mao's failure has filled millions of graves. That is not a boast, it is a statement of proportion. The author is not claiming infallibility. The author is claiming that the question must be asked, the evidence must be examined, and the victims of the CCP's historical revisionism deserve at least that much.
That feels like the right place to land. The research, whatever its ultimate reception in accredited academia, is doing something that accredited academia has been reluctant to do, naming the cost of the CCP's assault on Chinese history in human terms, and insisting that the iconographic record is not mythology, but testimony.
And the testimony, the research argues, is global. From the pattern stone in Wales to the Dama de Elche in Iberia, to the hieroglyphics of dynastic Egypt, to the bronze masks of Sanxingdui, the same writing system, the same compositional rules, the same cartographic foundation. The author's argument is not that China is exceptional. It is that China is part of something much larger, much older, and much more interconnected than either the CCP or Western academia has been willing to accept.
An unknown soldier, armed with a staff and a shadow and reading the history that 100 million deaths were spent trying to erase. It is, whatever else one makes of it, impossible to ignore.